Hello and welcome. This is the Swords of St. Michael channel, and if you're new here, I am really hoping that something's going to inspire you tonight. This is an excellent opportunity for you to really understand the depth and nature of spiritual warfare. Our series tonight is continuing the Discernment of Spirits, if you don't already have this book. Dr. Timothy Gallager took the time to write out St. Ignatius of Loyola's excellent instructions in these rules. And today there is no bigger one than we should understand than 13, breaking the silence. So sit right there. I'll be right back. As I said, I introduced myself, Sister Farah, OFS. I am a lay professed Franciscan sister. Therefore, I do not wear a habit. I do wear makeup. I live in the secular world as a professed religious. And for those of you that are unfamiliar with the ones that are familiar with the convents and the beautiful blue brown robes that professed religious do wear, we have plenty of those too. So this episode tonight is going to cover a very important lesson in Ignatius Loyola's Discernment of Spirits. And we're talking of spirits, we're talking about the negative spirits, the ugly spirits, the bad spirits that plague us in our minds, our hearts, other people, etc. And tonight, we really have to look at what is plaguing us, what is preventing us from speaking, how are we going to break the spiritual silence. So as always, I'm hoping you're going to get something out of this video. If you give it a big like, a big thumbs up, and hopefully you share it with somebody that might get a little bit of inspiration out of this teaching. This isn't my teaching. This is St. Ignatius of Loyola, very, very wise saint, about helping us in the spiritual warfare determine which are the good angels and which are the bad angels. So I go right into prayer and reading, and then we're going to discuss a little bit more. Thank you so much. Hang tight. In nomine Patri et Filii et Spiritus Sanctus, sic erat in principio et nunc et semper et saecula saeculorum. Sancte Michael Arcangele, defende nos in prelio. Contra nequitiam et insidias diaboli est presidium. In perit Deus, supplicis te precamur tuque. Princeps maletia celestis satana maliosque spiritus malignos. Qui ad perditionem animarum pervegantur in mundo divina, virtute in infernum detrude. Amen. Suscipe Domini universum meam libertatem, accipe memoriam intellectum atque voluntatem omnem, quidquid avio vera possideo, mihi largitus es, et tibi totem restitio actu et prorsus voluntati, claro, gubernandum, amore tui sulum, cum gratia tui mihi dones, et divisum satis ec alui quidquam ultra posco. Amen. The Discernment of Spirits, an Ignatian Guide for Everyday Living. Chapter and Rule 13. Breaking the Spiritual Silence. It is not good for us to be alone. Genesis 2:18. This biblical affirmation, applicable to our human nature in general, is true of the spiritual life and, in a particular way, of discernment of spirits. We have already noted that for Ignatius, communication with one knowledgeable in discernment is always a constitutive part of discernment of spirits. Through instruction and assistance in discerning from such a person, we grow and are intended to grow in our own ability to discern. Nonetheless, communication of our spiritual experience with a spiritually competent person remains an important part of discernment of spirits. It is not good for us to be alone. In Rule 13, Ignatius explicitly discusses this aspect of discernment. The context, like that of the previous rule, is still the deceits of the enemy and how to overcome them. In this rule, Ignatius describes the enemy's desire that we maintain silence regarding his troubling deceits. Ignatius will urge us, as we would expect, to do precisely the contrary. As in the preceding rule, there is a metaphor followed by the application. We will first discuss Ignatius' text and examine an example of this teaching. The 13th rule. The 13th. Likewise, he conducts himself as a false lover, in wishing to remain secret and not be revealed. For a dissolute man who, speaking with evil intention, makes dishonorable advances to a daughter of a good father or to a wife of a good husband, wishes his words and persuasions to be secret, and the contrary displeases him very much when the daughter reveals to her father or the wife to her husband his false words and depraved intention, because he easily perceives that he will not be able to succeed with the undertaking begun. In the same way, when the enemy of human nature brings his wiles and persuasions to the just soul, he wishes and desires that they be received and kept in secret. But when one reveals them to one's good confessor or to another spiritual person who knows his deceits and malicious designs, it weighs on him very much, because he perceives that he will not be able to succeed with the malicious undertaking he has begun, since his manifest deceits have thus been revealed. The quality of the enemy Ignatius highlights here is the enemy's desire, quote unquote, to remain secret and not be revealed. As in the preceding rule, the metaphor depicts an unnatural human situation, a love that is not an authentic love, but rather a false love, seeking only to use the other for selfish purposes. The metaphor is clear. The false lover desires that the intended victim remain silent regarding his seductions, since that silence alone permits the further progress of his own selfish undertaking. If, however, the intended victim speaks to the proper person about these seductions, the false lover easily perceives that he will not be able to succeed with the undertaking begun. Once the silence is broken, the false lover is utterly defeated. Ignatius notes, when, quote unquote, the enemy of human nature, end quote, troubles a just soul with his wiles and persuasions, he wishes and desires that he have these things be received and kept in secret. The enemy desires that the faithful person so afflicted receive and keep these persuasions, his workings, in their hearts secret, carrying them in silence and alone. And provided they maintain this silence, quote unquote, the malicious undertaking has begun, and it can progress with many doubts. What the enemy, in proposing his wiles and persuasion, is, when one reveals them to one's good confessor or to another spiritual person who knows his deceits and malicious designs, becomes open. When this occurs, he perceives that he will not be able to succeed, because his deceits have thus been revealed. This, then, is the spiritual action that Ignatius strongly counsels in Rule 13. That when faithful persons are troubled by the deceits of the enemy, they must not remain silent and isolated, but should speak of this interior burden with the appropriate spiritual persons. If they do so, they will be set free from the enemy's deceits. Ignatius's Rule 13 is of a crucial importance in the spiritual life and the spiritual journey. We cannot overstate the significance of this rule and its remarkable power to liberate dedicated persons from what may be at times long-standing discouragement and doubt. They need to be aware that the enemy will burden them with this deceits and malicious designs directed at them, and at the same time urge them to bear the burden in silence. This guideline regarding sharing with another touches deeply sensitive places in the human heart and must be grasped well. Let's look at the signs of the characteristic action of the enemy and the person with whom we would speak, and the content of which we are to share. What are the signs of such action of the enemy? Faithful people will find themselves in times of spiritual confusion, doubt, or discouragement, and may be considering spiritual changes born out of this discouragement and doubt. As this is occurring, they will sense promptings such as these in their mind. You cannot speak about this trouble. You can speak about anything else, but not about this. You must not speak about this to anyone, and if you do, the person with whom you speak will never understand you. The person will be shocked that you could be so weak, or feel such things in your heart, or think that you are thinking such high, lofty things. And that person will lose esteem that he has for you, and will no longer wish to believe you, accompany you, or support you in any way. That person will criticize you or laugh at you, and will confirm your fears about your own spiritual inadequacy, and it will be painful. It's best to say nothing and do everything you can yourself to carry this burden. Such persons, when spoken to in their mind by the enemy, may find that they are too busy to ask or to speak with the other, and do not wish to bother or take another's time for the problem that is just not all that important. They may find somehow they never manage to connect with another. And certainly there may be other objective reasons and other difficulties in meeting or arranging with a given person. Yet, when both factors are found simultaneously, spiritual trouble of the heart and resistance to speaking with the appropriate spiritual person, then faithful people must ask themselves whether the enemy's actions may not be involved. The enemy wishes, St. Ignatius says, for us to remain secret, and none of these disturbances be revealed. Now who is the appropriate spiritual person with whom these spiritually troubles should speak? Are there also persons with whom they should not speak? These are good, key questions, and Ignatius answers them carefully. Ignatius describes, with several modifiers, two appropriate spiritual persons, one more specific and one more general. The first he mentions is a good confessor. In the first description of the appropriate spiritual person with whom to speak, and the second being more general, the first is linked in a sacramental context, the good confessor. The second is inclusive of all spiritual persons knowledgeable of the enemy's working, or to another spiritual person being someone who knows the deceits and malicious designs of the enemy. Now here Ignatius mentions only one essential qualification, that this person be familiar with the tactics of the enemy and therefore competent to listen to and spiritually assist and assist one troubled with these tactics. This might include suitably trained spiritual directors, retreat directors, spiritually experienced clergy, religious, lay people, a spiritual friend, and similar persons. Note, the people who are also absent from Ignatius' descriptions of the appropriate spiritual persons with whom spiritually troubled persons should speak. All persons are not adequately familiar with the enemy's deceits and malicious designs. They are not appropriate candidates for this role. They may be good, sincere, faith-filled people. Yet, if they do not possess sufficient knowledge of the enemy's ways, they may, with very good intentions, either fail to assist or compound the difficulties of these troubled persons. If one, in their time of trouble, does speak of their struggles with a good but spiritually unprepared person rather than their appropriate spiritual director or religious, they are unlikely to receive the same assistance, and their trouble may persist. One must speak with a spiritually competent person, and once they do, they will be set free from this burden. Now, the content of what is to be communicated by spiritually troubled persons must be appropriate to the spiritual person. The person being spoken to must be familiar of the enemy and the ways that the enemy will attempt to dissuade, burden, and communicate the wiles and persuasions. In Rule 13, as always, Ignatius is speaking of discernment of spirits and of what has direct and immediate reference to our lives of faith and pursuit of God's will. His teaching is very clear. If dedicated persons are spiritually burdened by the enemy's wiles and persuasions, they are to speak of this with an appropriate spiritual person, knowing that in doing so, they will progress toward freedom from these wiles and persuasion. This spiritual guide must recognize, therefore, when the interior trouble is non-spiritual, psychological, in other words, and so beyond the purview of Ignatius' 13th rule. Certainly communication to another person about non-spiritual burdens may be very liberating for the non-spiritually, psychologically troubled person. Decisions regarding whether a person is emotionally prepared to speak of such psychological burdens may at times involve complex, affective issues. Such decisions do not pertain to discernment of spirits and are best left to those professionally qualified to make them. Psychological distress and its healing through communication with another human issues are of the greatest importance. They are not, however, the issues in which Ignatius is treating rule number 13. Now we take an example from the writings of Thomas Merton. This will illustrate more amply a back and forth dynamic that would be characteristic to the 13th rule in practice. The young Thomas Merton visited Trappist monks in Kentucky. While there, a question remained in his mind. Is the Lord really calling me to be a Trappist monk? He continued to teach at St. Bonaventure. The vocational question was a mingling of attraction and anxiety. It consumed Merton. He wrote, "The fight went on in my mind. By now, the problem had resolved itself into one practical issue. Why don't I consult someone about the whole question? More practical still, here at St. Bonaventure's, there's one priest I came to know well during the last year, a wise and good philosopher. I knew I could trust him. Why did I not ask him? One absurd, crazy thing held me up. A blind impulse. Confused me, obscure, irrational. It amounted to a vague subconscious fear that I would once and for all be told I definitely had no vocation. It was the fear of an ultimate refusal." Merton faced this spiritual question of the greatest importance of his life. He knew he needed to speak with a spiritually competent person in this regard. He identified the appropriate spiritual person in the person of a Franciscan professor he knew. Merton imagined what would happen if he shared his vocational hopes and doubts. He imagined the death of all his hopes would inevitably would follow. His fear, he says, was that I would once and for all be told I had no vocation. And the imagined scenario effectively restrained him from speaking. Merton spoke to no one and remained in that state of indecision for months. And after many hours of intense prayer, alone in the darkness of the evening, Merton gathered the courage to return to the building of this Franciscan mentor and speak and try once again. Merton came into the courtyard, into the friar's common room, and the lights were out. However, upon entering, there was one friar, his esteemed Father Philotheus. I asked if I could speak with him, and we went into his room. That was the end of all my anxiety, all my hesitation. As soon as I proposed all my hesitations and questions to him, Father Philotheus said that he could see no reason why I shouldn't want to enter a monastery and become a priest. It may seem irrational, but at that moment it was as if the scales fell off my own eyes, and looking back on all my worries and questions, I could see clearly how empty and futile they had been. Accident, circumstances, had all contributed to exaggerate and distort things in my mind. Now everything was straight. I was full of peace and the consciousness that everything was right and that a straight road had opened out, clear and smooth, ahead of me. I went upstairs like someone who had been called back from the dead. Never had I experienced the calm, untroubled peace and certainty that filled my heart. Merton's text example. It's a clear illustration of Ignatius' 13th rule. The gap between the imagined and the real scenario is very present. The first promising the end of hope, the second confirming hope and giving new life. This gap is the clear indication of the deception contained in the enemy's urging to secrecy. The enemy suggests that dedicated people should remain quiet and stay secret because it will serve their good to do so. In actual fact, it serves only the enemy's deceits and malicious designs. Once Merton does speak, the enemy's deceptions are clearly eliminated. Should such persons experiencing this hesitation, this need for secrecy, this dynamic, the back and forth, This is the time to recall Ignatius's 13th rule. In the choice to speak, they will find freedom. So we can see, wow, that was a lot. We can see that the deception, the battlefield clearly is in our mind. Our mind is just a fertile place for the deposits of these thoughts and fears and suggestions to enter in and literally strangle us. And in this stranglehold of worrying about what we're going to say and who we're going to talk to, we choose not to. And that is our biggest barrier. And I remember sometimes growing up, my dad would tell me, "You're your own worst enemy." And I would think, well, yeah, sometimes I would hold myself back from being a lifeguard or doing things like that because I was afraid I wouldn't make it. That's the enemy. That's the enemy. When you know you have you've been given everything it takes to do exactly what you're doing, but the doubts are eating you alive inside your mind and you speak to no one of them because you're so afraid that your doubts are going to be confirmed with the person that you trust and looked up to, because everything is riding on their acceptance of hearing what you have to say. That's the enemy. And I really like, and I have to address how he identifies that there are psychological effects in all of us, from past trauma wounds, none of us had a perfect life, before we decide on our vocations. So as he's going through this, he warns us that there will be psychological terrors. There will be psychological questions that may or may not be reassured by our friends and the loving pillars that we choose to have around us. So it's good if you're experiencing psychological battles with yourself, such as if you were raised to be a pleaser, if you grew up, thinking you always had to keep your mouth quiet, you could never voice your opinion. It's good to speak with a psychological counselor that can help you overcome patterns of behavior that don't serve you. That's different than the discernment of spirits. So, if you're not new and you've got your journal and you'd like to go a little bit deeper and question yourself, I've got something for us to think about. When I was looking at this, I really thought to myself, wow, we have so many opportunities in our prayer life and our spiritual life to be very confident. When we talk about the consolations and the desolations, we have many, many things that we can look at, our past. We can look at the things that we're called to, the people that we get such great joy in, practicing our vocation, in praying for other people. And as I began this, and I was saying, there's a lot, I know a lot of people that practice their faith and they suffer a great deal. And we're taught, that when we're suffering, we can offer up our suffering to the heavens for the lost souls, the forgotten souls, the holy souls in purgatory. So when we're raised with that tradition of believing that, well, I'm just going through something, I'm going to offer it up. This could be a lie of the devil, and this is why we cannot be alone on our spiritual journey. This is why when we have things that are very even simple in our daily lives, such as, should I volunteer on the committee? Should I go this direction? Should I seek a deeper path to my faith and spirituality? The simple things can be attacked in our lives too. And the simple ways that we look at things and think, oh, well, that's just a doubt, that's a fear, I talked to my best friend about it. No, St. Ignatius says, when we're talking about spiritual discernment, when we're talking about spiritual growth, when we're talking about our vocational directive with all the talents that we're given, we need that spiritual person, that spiritual professed lay clergy, someone that is familiar with the antics of all these little demons in our head, messing us up, causing us great doubt, saying, nope, don't talk to them. They're going to laugh at you. Don't say it. They're going to tell you have no business doing this. They're going to confirm all your worst fears. And this is very, very common in all Christian circles, that as we reach points of change and as we reach for new levels of growth, the enemy's going to be there. The enemy's going to be right there, trying to hide all these little deceptions in your head, trying to make you doubt and be uncomfortable. So, for this week, let's think about, why these offering up of the regular sufferings that we have. How does that not apply here? How does it absolutely not apply? So how can we remain faithful to taking care of what needs to be taken care of, such as in the spiritual warfare? We find that we simply must share our struggles with another. We must find that spiritual person, that lay person, that confessor that we can open our hearts to and say, this is what I've been thinking, and this is what I believe I'm called to do, and this is what's holding me back. This is what I'm thinking. And they will confirm a sense of freedom and a sense of peace, that you don't have to not talk anymore. You don't have to not say anything anymore. You don't have to listen to the wiles of the enemy anymore. Okay? Don't do it. Break the silence. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us tonight. I'm hoping that you get some inspiration out of this teaching. Chapter 13, Breaking the Silence. This is Swords of St. Michael. SwordsofStMichael.com has many binding, healing, helping prayers for someone seeking spiritual self-exorcism and deliverance. Also, for prayer, etc., there's Prayers by the Bead that has many beautiful rosaries, saints, all sorts of fun stuff on it. Thank you so much for joining. Please give us a big thumbs up, a like, and drop a comment, and lots of suggestions are always welcome. So God bless you. God keep you. Don't forget, Swords of St. Michael is here to help you win the fight and do it right. Until next week, take care.